Hey guys, Phylaris here. Have you ever found yourself trying to take a scuttle crab or invade an enemy jungle camp thinking you had priority, only to find yourself getting collapsed on by the enemy laners? I get questions about this situation all the time. It's infuriating, and it feels like your entire game is getting ruined by no fault of your own. It's one of the most frustrating situations to deal with as a jungler. Now, no matter what you do, this is going to keep happening. Your laners are not perfect players. Shocking, right? But I'm hoping in this video to reframe the way in which you think about and approach this kind of scenario, because there are many times when some, or even most of the fault lies not with the laners, but with you, the jungler. Now to kick things off, let's quickly talk about priority. Any experienced jungler understands that one of the first things you look for before making an aggressive play in river or the enemy jungle is lane priority. An analogy I like to use is that crossing the river in League is like crossing the street in real life. What do you always do before crossing the street? You look both ways. Priority loosely refers to the ability of an allied laner to move for a play before their opposing laner, thereby providing a temporary numbers advantage. The way in which you typically check for lane priority is by looking for push. When your allied laner is able to clear the minion wave first, the enemy laner is theoretically stuck clearing their wave out before they can move. In the analogy, this would mean that the enemy laners have a red light. Now, the first mistake that junglers tend to make is mistaking a push advantage for immediate actionable priority that an allied laner can use to help them. Just because a laner has a push advantage doesn't mean he can move right away. If he tries to, the enemy laner can simply freeze the wave on him and move as well. Your laner needs time to actually crash his wave into the enemy turret. This denies the freeze and forces the enemy laner to give up the minions to the turret if he wants to move right away as well. In the Nocturne example, the allied Cassante does have push advantage, but he cannot simply move into river to aid the Nocturne on Scuttlecrab. The wave would freeze in front of Darius' turret, and Darius would be able to move simultaneously. If Nocturne wanted Cassante's help on the Scuttlecrab or for an invade, then instead of immediately walking into river and waiting around, he should have walked into the top lane first to help Cassante crash the wave more quickly. So whenever you look for priority, you need to form a quick mental estimation of how long it'll take your laners to actually crash their waves. Simply being above the halfway mark of the lane does not mean that the laners can move right away. Now, sometimes your laners do have an actual push advantage and are able to crash the wave in a relevant amount of time. This still does not mean that you have actionable priority from that lane. There's a term that I want you to add to your jungle vocabulary, and that is weak priority. Weak priority is when your laner does have prio, but that advantage simply doesn't mean much. This could occur for a number of reasons. Number one, the wave may simply be too small to be relevant. If there's only a couple minions for the enemy laner to clear, he isn't going to be stuck in the lane for very long. And if you're going for an aggressive play in the enemy jungle, he's often going to have a more direct path to reach you than your allied laner does. Number two, your laner may be too low on resources by the time he crashes the wave. If he's low on HP, has a lot of gold unspent, or has to expend his remaining mana pool in order to crash the wave, he's not going to have a lot to offer in the case of a fight. Instead, he'd really like to use the turn that he gained by crashing the wave first in order to take a recall. Laners like Ryze commonly end up in this kind of position in the early game. They secure push by spamming their abilities on the wave, but then they run out of mana and have to take a recall. If you go for an aggressive invade thinking you have priority from your mid laner without checking his mana, that's your fault. Number three, your laner may just be very weak. Even if a champion like Vladimir can and will push in certain waves in the early game, he's simply not a very strong champion at that point in the game. Even if he's able to move first, if the enemy Zed or Kiana or Sylas is able to follow soon after, you're not likely to be at an advantage in the fight. And finally, number four, your laner may not be able to connect with you. If your team does not have vision control in the space between you and your laner, and you do not have exact knowledge on the enemy jungler's location, your laner could simply get collapsed on if he tries to move into river to reach you. This is incredibly common when you have something like a control mage against a melee mid matchup. Your control mage will typically have push priority due to his range advantage. However, he's incredibly vulnerable to ganks due to his lack of durability and mobility. He cannot simply walk into river blindly to reach you whenever you want to be aggressive. For example, take the scenario where you full clear from bot to top and you want to contest the top scuttle crab. You see your laner has pushed mid, so you think you have priority. However, what if the enemy jungler is hovering around the pixel or river bush? If your laner moves into river to try to support you, he might get ganked. In this case, he didn't have the ability to safely connect to you, so he's unable to immediately apply his lane priority to secure an advantage on your half of the map. So whenever you're checking your lanes for priority from now on, I want you to make sure that the priority isn't weak or fake. Now, in saying all of this, I don't want to make it sound like it's always the jungler's fault. Let's take a case where the jungler actually does everything correctly. You're tracking the opposing jungler and you know you can beat him. You check your lanes and your nearby laners all have priority and you ping your intentions. But you still get collapsed on with no help and die. This happens all the time and it sucks. To understand how to combat this, let's go back to our analogy. When you want to cross the street, you look left and you look right. When it's a red light for the coming cars, you get to cross. But does a red light mean that a car cannot pass? No, it just means that it should not pass. Drivers run red lights all the time. If you're a pedestrian and you see a car that runs a red light, do you keep going, walk in front of that car, and go, "Hey man, it was a red light"? No, you're gonna die. It's not your job as a pedestrian to go punish that driver. Your job is to be aware at all times and get the fuck out of the way. Whose job is it to punish that driver? The police. Now, in League, we don't have police, but what we do have are minions. Remember, the reason the light was red for the enemy cars was because the enemy laners were supposed to clear their minion waves before moving. If they disregard this to come collapse on you, what happens to those minions? Exactly, they disappear. Now, I want you to tell me, why were you invading in the first place, or going for Scuttle Crab in the first place? What do camps give? What does Crab give? Gold and experience. Now tell me, what do minions give? Right, gold and experience. Your job as a jungler is to maximize the resource gap between your team and the enemy team. When enemy laners drop waves to come stop you, it's basically like you're ganking them without ever having to show up in their lanes. Chances are, if you simply waste their time a bit and then back off, give up that Scuttle Crab, the enemy may lose even more resources than you would have gained from the initial play anyways. So does it still feel bad when you have to back off of a camp that by all rights should have belonged to you? Yeah, it still feels bad. It's hard on the ego as a jungler. Your laners probably should have moved. But that's the great thing about playing with priority. As long as you stay aware and respect the bad drivers, it's a win-win. If the enemy laners come when they're not supposed to, as long as you can suck up your pride in the moment and back off, your team will still come out ahead. Alright, that's it for this video. I'm hoping you guys learned something useful. If you enjoyed the content and want to see more, then feel free to drop a subscribe and click that notification bell. A quick reminder that I do coach over at nice.gg, and as always, a big thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping to make this channel possible.